Morning everybody and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Christelle Rinn and today we are delighted to have Derek McKay with us from Adair HRM. So welcome Derek, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks at all.
So we're really going to focus today on the employment law updates. So over the last year, it's been, I suppose, a busy period for changes to employment legislation and kind of talks about future changes as well. So when have things been enacted? When are things going to be enacted? So we're really just going to thankfully, Derek has given us his time today to go through those key legislative changes. So as usual, we have a questions and answers section within the Teams application here. So if at any time anybody has any questions throughout the webinar, if you want to put your question there, and I won't be answering them, I shall pose them to Derek for his superior knowledge. And then if there's anything that might be a little bit too, I suppose, specific to your company, we can set up a call with Derek later on, but between yourselves, and you can discuss that offline. But feel free to post your questions in there, and we'll kind of try to take them throughout, or if not, we'll wait till the end. So Derek, I suppose, if you want to introduce yourself before I start rambling on.
Yeah, not at all. Look, as always, I'll try and share as much information we can here. It's been a very busy year from an employment law perspective so far, with still potentially a lot more to happen this side of Christmas. So I'm the founder of Adair Human Resource Management, and I suppose in the context of today, the Linea platform that we have is all the information that we're going to talk about. But really, it's just to give as much insight for attendees around the different changes, as you said, the changes that are due to happen. And as always, keep it practical. And I look to do, what should organisations seek to do now, and what should they be aware of and start to plan for in the future?
Yeah. So I suppose one of the areas that we were looking into, Derek, first we were chatting about before, is in terms of the dignity at work. So if we're looking at bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, obviously these are things that most companies, that they should have policies on, or they should have them in their handbooks, and should be, they shouldn't be just pulled down when an issue happens. They should be constantly being reviewed. But my understanding is that in particular, in terms of the code of practice on sexual harassment and harassment, that it was updated earlier this year. So in terms of the changes to this code, what should organisations be looking at?
Yeah, well, I think organisations a lot of the time use the words bullying and harassment interchangeably, which I can see how and why it happens, but I suppose a key thing for organisations is to understand the difference between the two and the difference in the policies around them. So the code of practice on the prevention and resolution of bullying was updated to really the latter part of 2020, the start of 2021, and there's some fundamental changes as it relates to bullying in the workplace, which is repeated inappropriate behaviour. The code of practice on harassment and sexual harassment, as you rightly say, has been updated this year. So with those changes to the codes of practice, it really means organisations need to look at the policy that they hopefully have in place and update it accordingly with the amendments to the code of practice on harassment and sexual harassment. So this particular code of practice reiterates a lot of what's most important for organisations, which is about reminding people that it is discrimination if it occurs in the workplace, highlights the reasonable steps for organisations to take to prevent harassment and sexual harassment happening in the workplace, reminds organisations about the workplace extends to their place of work, which can be off-site at training, can be working in a remote hub with other people. And also it talks about how to prevent reoccurrences of behaviour if they happen in the workplace. So there's a number of things within the code of practice that organisations absolutely must, I would say, have in their policies to demonstrate they're looking to prevent or manage these issues should they arise in the workplace. But there's an increased emphasis around training of managers, employees, everyone, again, to prevent these issues happening. And equally, it talks about even as part of the induction, making sure people are aware of the policies and practices very early on. So whilst there's probably not as many fundamental changes to the code of practice, it presents a great opportunity for organizations to bring it back to life. And there's a huge emphasis in it about communications, because as you touched upon there, if you only bring out your policy and procedure after the fact, from being involved in many cases and investigations, that's unfortunately probably one of your biggest problems, that people say no one was aware of the policy, and potentially the policy isn't even correct anyway.
And I think that's the key, isn't it? And we always come back to that, your communication around these policies, that just, they're in the handbook. Obviously, somebody starts on day one and they sign it, and then you never look at it ever again. Hopefully not. But that there is that ongoing training, specifically for new managers. I think that sometimes we forget about that maybe somebody gets promoted within and they become a manager, and we forget that they need to go through how to handle if somebody comes to them with something, how to handle, if there is an allegation of harassment. And like you said, that there is difference between bullying and harassment. So maybe just that internal training is so important.
Yeah, and not to be afraid to use the words, because it does strike fear, if there's a complaint that comes in and it references harassment or sexual harassment, and reminding people harassment isn't, I say, the verb to harass. It's harassment based on the 9 equality grounds: gender, age, race, civil status, and again, understanding that's discrimination ultimately. But there's so many opportunities, even as we talk through the amount of legislative changes that are happening and will happen, that you just remind people to say, yes, we might be introducing a new policy on something else. And as a reminder, here's our dignity at work policy. So not to be afraid to talk about what behaviours are not acceptable in the workplace, and how we could, ensure we've got respectful workplace for all included. And I think sometimes there's the fear that if organizations start using the words harassment or sexual harassment, people are assuming there's a problem, when I'd be the opposite, saying you want people to be talking about it. And one of the things in the code talks about people challenging these sort of behaviours in the workplace. So it is an addition to code to say, employees themselves should challenge it if they're witnessing or recipient of these sort of behaviours in the workplace, because obviously they're unwarranted and unwanted in the workplace. And
it's interesting, Derek, years ago I worked for with a company, and the HR manager said, "Oh, we don't like to talk about harassment because it gives people ideas."
and that's again the attitude that comes back to say as well, if someone's challenging a complaint that's come in or a claim in relation to it, they will use the code of practice as the basis of what did you do to prevent this happening firstly. If it happens, what did you do to effectively manage it? And thirdly, what did you do to prevent its reoccurrence? And if you're not ahead of that in your policy and the application of that policy, you can see the direction of travel, how that employment matters going to end up.
Okay, so main thing around that area is review what you have, make sure you take it out, make sure it's up to date, and implement some training around with managers, and communicate what the policy is.
Communicate and document those communications. And it's not just we'll do it once and then we'll wait for it. Like the code of practice hasn't changed in 10 years, so don't wait for a new code or a new change. Have it in your calendar to say every 6 months we're going to remind people of policies, or every quarter, whatever it is most appropriate, and using the appropriate forums. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. So the next thing, which we've heard a lot about, it's been introduced into the UK for a number of years in regards to that gender pay gap reporting. We've introduced it here into HRLocker in terms of an actual report. Complicated report. It's not as simple as male versus female, how much they're getting paid. There's a lot more to it than that in terms of age ranges and length of service and things like that. So it's not just as simple as I've 10 males and 10 women, 10 females, 10 males, that's how much they get paid. A little bit more to it than that. But in regards to the gender pay gap reporting, if we're looking at, there's a lot in terms of the size of your company, how often they have to do it. So what does it actually mean to organizations, I suppose, today? And specifically, it's an interesting one. Like, I've watched it in the UK. Have we taken any learnings from them as well? So I suppose double whammy question for you, Derek, is what do organizations actually need to do today? And is there any learnings?
Yeah, I think, look, it's been in the background for several years that it was to be introduced in Ireland, came into effect in June for the larger organizations, 250 plus employees. So they've had a long lead-in time. My experience is a lot of them didn't necessarily take advantage of that long lead-in time to understand how this is going to impact them, who else they need to get involved. And you're right, it's a lot more complex in terms of its reporting. So whilst I know we're not using slides today, what I'm going to do, I know I mentioned to you, I'm just going to pull up something on the Linea platform just to I will show the complexity of it rather than trying to explain it as such. So like, and this is a section obviously we updated ourselves when the legislation was enacted. So we have under during employment under gender pay gap, we have the information there about the legislation. So I'm just going to bring up the actual section on this, because just a number of key things that are very relevant. So under our in-depth analysis here, what we do is we have, so we've outlined, it starts with the 250 employees, as we know. So they're required to take a snapshot in June of their payroll ultimately and all the remuneration and have their report now for December. So straight away we're seeing that organisations are going to be, I would say a number of them, quite under pressure to be able not just to produce the information and validate it that it's 100% correct, but the reporting is a lot more than just producing the number. You know, so it is detailing the commentary around it and describing as to why or how this gender pay gap, if it exists, has it come about. So as you rightly said earlier, there's many different calculations required. There's actually 11 different sets of calculations required. The median hourly rate of pay, the mean hourly rate of pay, the mean bonus, median bonus. I won't go through them all, but I know we've spent significant time internally with my team looking at, well, how does that impact organisations? And at the end of the day, whatever the number is, it's going to be the number from an organisation's perspective. It's what they have done and what they're going to do to try and bridge that gap is going to be extremely important, I think, for organisations to be able to explain. And one of the areas, again, that we sought to capture, and I think hopefully it answers your question, is what has happened both from the UK and Irish developments in here. So we've seen a number of learnings from the UK as to, well, what does this possibly mean? So we've seen certain sectors and industries being more impacted because they're more male-dominated jobs. Some of them can be engineering, construction, etc. We've seen part-time working pay and progression being part of the challenge. And then this unconscious bias potentially there as well, which we know we've seen a lot more about unconscious bias training, etc. But I think if I look at my HR hat on, and I've heard this before from talking to UK organisations, that having the tools, the technologies to do this well is something organisations underestimated. How the depth of the depth of information analysis and where they get their data from is absolutely key. Being able to onboard the stakeholders, because this isn't a HR thing. This is obviously a governance board, CEO, CFO, a lot of key stakeholders involved in this, and to onboard all of those senior managers and providing that narrative for the gender pay gap, both internally and externally. So, right, the UK, we've had 5 years of seeing what's worked or not worked at times within the UK. And some interesting things I've seen in the UK is organisations who've managed to successfully positively impact their gender pay gap, so reduce it. Some of them have actually started to increase again because there's been changes in the workforce, different appointments. So it doesn't always mean you're reducing it. Different things can happen in the business that unfortunately starts to increase it again. And we've included some other information there. I won't go through in relation to some of the Irish organisations that are being very proactive. But for me, today, I would say, look, organisations of 250 plus, no, this is on their to-do list, and they shouldn't just treat it as a HR item. This is an organisational matter. From 2024, it'll be 150 or 150 employees plus, and that'll go down then to 50 employees thereafter. So it's going to impact a significant number of organisations. Don't wait until it's you're technically required to do it. I would do it now. If I had 51 employees, I'd be running these reports now and putting steps in place to try and bridge a gap if it exists.
Because it's an interesting one, Derek, because I was one, when I looked at all the calculations, I was like, wow, this is really complicated. Like it's not just, like I said, it's not just male, female. The other thing is, I think what, in terms of the UK, which is interesting side of things, is people do have to, you get that number at the end of the calculation. So, they're reporting it once a year, that's your number, so it's the narrative around it that is important. You could be in a male dominated industry, wrongly or rightly, but regardless, I suppose the narrative around it is important, that you're maybe saying you're trying in the next 2 years to put a program in place to bring in female leadership or whatever it is.
Yes.
But that at least the narrative is you're saying you see that there is an issue here and you're going to address it.
Yeah, I think there's kind of 3 benchmarks for me that organizations will default to. Well, certainly 2 of them to start. One will be their industry, to say, well, how are we doing compared to our competitors? So we might be 35% as a gender pay gap, but the others are 50%. So aren't we wonderful? Which I think is a wrong metric, but you can imagine that'll be part of the narrative. People will default to what the national gender pay gap is, which is around 14%. So they'll go, well, are we above or below the national gender pay gap? So again, people saying, well, if we're only 10%, aren't we wonderful? Because we're below the average. What they really should be focusing in on, as someone like Unpust did, how do we get to 0? So not necessarily saying, are we just better than others? The question is, are we the best for our employees? And that should be the aspiration. But it's going to be a journey, and there's going to be 2 steps forward at times, 1 step back for certain organizations, but now's the time to get on the journey. And as you rightly say, start doing initiatives now that it removes the bias that can happen in recruitment, internally stroke externally, encourages greater female participation in management or leadership roles, more flexible work policies, which I know we'll touch upon some of the legislation around it, but sometimes the legislation is the baseline, what you have to do. Can you go well above and beyond that to encourage greater participation of females in the workforce for different jobs? So there's a lot, and the beauty is there's so much done already out there in the market that you can learn from it. But let's not forget, a challenging market at the moment, talent is tight. This is going to hit potentially your employee value proposition in a negative way, or arguably in a positive way if you're able to demonstrate how positive, proactive you have been in this area.
And I think the key is as well, Derek, I don't know, do you agree with that? Yes, of course, the reporting might lie with HR, that you're by default the people who have the numbers. But in terms of actually putting a strategy in place on how to maybe reduce that gender pay gap or explain it, it's a company-wide issue. It's your board, it's your management team. It's not, that can't just purely be HR driven.
I think if HR take the responsibility for this, they're not going to come out well at the other end, because they're all the things that impact this take time, and it's not within the direct control. And I had a meeting recently with a diversity and inclusion consultant, fantastic person, and they said if they're being brought into an organization, unless the CEO on board meet them at the start, they won't engage with the organization, because they're saying there's no point trying to influence HR or other people who don't have the full influence. So their starting point is, are you genuinely looking to resolve this matter? If not, I'm not the person for you as your D&I person to really embed it. And what they don't want is a D&I strategy beside these other strategies. What they want is D&I right across the board in every single thing that the organization does. And I think that's a really powerful way for organizations to understand that's the approach potentially to ED&I, rather than let's just do some isolated training and these other things that may, and it's a big may, have an impact on the gap.
Down the line, your every strategy, it has to be an element of every strategy.
Absolutely, and it's front and center. It's a bit like dignity at work. You don't just have your dignity at work and say, but our behaviours over here are going to be different. It's behaviours, full stop, in the organisation. So I suppose it is a bit about, what's the DNA of the organisation, back into the culture, and what they're aspiring to do. So getting them to that 0 rather than let's just be better than the national average. Yeah.
Derek, I have a couple of questions here that we're just going to digress to just for a moment. So I have one here, and I think this is just in regards to the initial point we were talking about in regards to the sexual harassment and harassment at work, and in regards to that code of practice. So Obviously, this needs to be documented. What are the GDPR impacts? If an employee asks to see all their data, how do you have to, sorry, do you have to disclose internal HR management records about an employee?
Yeah, so I suppose the whole area of data protection and something GDPR is very clear that an employee has access to hard and soft copies of their own file. So there should be nothing on an employee file that you're not willing to share. So in the context of harassment and sexual harassment, maybe that's the question, that if someone makes a complaint against me as an employee, in order to resolve that complaint, I should be involved as the respondent to it, even on an informal or mediated basis. So it's not that someone makes an anonymous complaint and I've never had the opportunity to respond. So there should be nothing on my file that I'm not aware of. Now, equally then, if it's a mediated process, that's a confidential process that doesn't contain the details of mediation. It'll contain a one-liner to say mediation was engaged with and the parties have agreed a way forward. And that's what sits on the file, not, what the mediator said, what the party said in mediation, because that's confidential. So yeah, I suppose in essence, that you never want to produce information off an employee file, particularly around complaints if it has been made against them or inferred against them that they haven't been had the opportunity to respond to.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And actually, it was quite interesting as well, just on a separate note in regards to the whistleblower side of things as well, that the person who makes the complaint, well, so contacts the whistleblower side and makes the complaint. Of course, they've made the complaint. It could be against somebody else. Sorry, if they could make somebody aware of something, they're not entitled to know what's happened because it's not to do with them, anymore.
Absolutely.
But so that there is still that anonymity around the mediation side of things. But if the complaint is being made about somebody else, they need to know it's being made about them.
Exactly, and you're right. It's completely different for the whistleblowing. That anonymity is an important part of whistleblowing, but it's not about someone's behaviour on the whistleblowing side. It's about a breach of kind of could be something to do with something statutory, essentially. But the principle of fairness and natural justice when it comes to the code of practice and any of the codes of practice, harassment, sexual harassment, bullying, discipline, grievance, natural justice, you'll see factored into those.
Yeah. So I'm just going to take two more and then we'll go ahead. But we will answer all the questions at the end there. So I think I know what the answer is to this, but you can answer it, Derek. If you know there is no gender pay gap in your organization, is there anything that you need to do?
Well, firstly, I would say, and our annual HR barometer looks at gender pay gap, and it tells us that less than 20% of organizations actually measure gender pay gap. So, but yet, I think about 60 or 70% say they don't have one. So there's a very contradictory message out there that people aren't measuring it, but they don't have one. It's not equal pay, and it's not that we have got pay scales in place that treats everyone fairly. That's not what gender pay gap is. If they don't have one, that's fantastic, and there's a certain number of organizations that would be in the case. They still have to continue to work at it ultimately, because as I said, the UK example, we've seen organizations actually go down and go back up again because they've had changes, usually in senior roles within the organization, or they've changed business units and closed down a business unit or whatever it might be. So whilst it is at a given moment in time that the measurement's taken, obviously it's an annual report. So you would expect it can and will change over time. But regardless of the reporting, the principle should be, are we doing right by employees regardless of their gender? And I think that's, and the same on the D&I front, that essence should be the focus, that we have to do a report at the end, and yes, we have to justify what's in it, but we should be aspiring for that regardless of whether government introduced legislation around it. But brilliant if people have a zero, and I'd love to hear from them to see what maybe they've done that has gotten them to this particular place, particularly depending on what industry they're in, and be a great case study.
Absolutely. And we'll just take one more and then we'll move on, Derek. And this is actually really interesting, is I would like Derek's opinion on whether an agency, so agency workers, are they included in the headcount for gender pay gap? If they're not accruing service, so at the snapshot date, should they be included in the headcount?
A very good question. I'd have to caveat with it. I'd have to double check on that.
Glad I didn't
My
answer.
initial response would be that no, they wouldn't be. They'd be in the headcount of the agency, who is the employer, and not the organization where they may be deployed to, because they won't be on the payroll of the on site. However, the agency might have more than 250 employees, and they're required to look at the gender pay gap. And I can come back to you when you want to share an answer, but I'll check with our legal. But my initial response would be no, they wouldn't be in the head count of the organization where they might be deployed to.
But part of the head count of the agency.
Oh, absolutely. They are employed by, assuming they're not a contractor, so assuming they are an employee of the agency, so they have the same rights to obviously all the employment legislation, annual leave, public holidays. It's just that the agency, I suppose invoices the company, and obviously a lot of the particularly American companies have large outsourced number of personnel doing certain types of jobs or certain functions. So yeah, it's quite prevalent in Ireland that there's a lot of agency workers out there. But yeah, first and foremost, they are who their employer is the agency for most legislation. And there is something there in terms of unfair dismissals, but we can get to that at a different conversation.
That's another day's work.
Yes, the whole new webinar. Absolutely.
Do that next time. So, and again, I'll get back to all the questions at the end. I just want to make sure we're going through the questions here with Derek, the topics with Derek. So if we move on to sick leave, Derek, there's been a lot of talk about in regards to paid sick leave, how much people get paid, is it moving up, is it 2-3 days, whatever it is. So if we're looking at the signed off employment legislation within the government, so how will this impact, I suppose, both employers and employees, because you know they're both involved in it, and you know, when is it actually coming into effect? Because I think we're behind of when it's supposed to be in, and it's been talked about considerably. And you know, also that kind of cadence of the 3, the 5, the 7 days as well.
Yeah, look, you're right. It was due to be enacted at the start of 2022. It's now going to be January 2023. So in a good way, employers have plenty of lead-in time. They would have plenty of lead-in time for January this year, because it was being bounced around for many times, and it hasn't significantly changed from, I suppose, what was in the bill. So absolutely 1st of Jan 2023. I think my starting point is, though, for organizations who have a sick pay policy that's more favorable than the legislation, this is not their opportunity to revert to the lower of the two, because if you have established terms and conditions or potentially perceived as a benefit under sick pay, you know, that you can't fundamentally change in terms and conditions without agreement by employees. So just to put that out there, that it's not
locked in.
It's not the lowest common denominator, for sick pay. So certain sectors, as we know, would have more generous sick pay than what the legislation is going to enact from 2023. You're right, it starts over kind of a 4-year cadence. 3 days with effect from next year, up to 5 days, 7 and 10 days, ultimately by year 4. And it is capped in terms of 70% of the person's normal wage, or up to €110 a day. So if you have high-paying executives, it is capped, but more likely they've got a more favourable sick pay policy anyway. So what we're seeing is this is very much going to have a much greater impact on certain sectors that wouldn't usually have any sort of sick pay policy in place. Employees will be required to provide a medical certificate and have, I suppose, the requisite minimum service of over 13 weeks to be able to qualify for the sick leave. So look, I think in general, it is a positive development in employment legislation. Yes, it is a cost, no doubt, to businesses, but we know a lot of businesses have a lot in place already supporting well-being and sick pay. So this is just putting it on a statutory footing.
Yeah, and I think it's just to make sure that, like you said, you have that statutory footing in. If you already have something that's higher, fantastic, keep going with that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Around the right to work, the right to request remote working, we've had a couple of talks on this, Derek, and it's an interesting one in terms of what is actually going to go in the bill. And what I mean by that is that it's not just a free for all. You can't just request it and and you get a yes answer for it. I suppose it's really about what eventually is going to go into the bill, how what's the refusal side of things, what's the actual, you know, the grounds for refusal, but also the grounds for maybe instead of doing 5 days a week remote, if somebody's requested 5, can you say let's do 3, or, you know, how exactly do you think the legislation is going to affect the working, the way we work at the in the future?
Yeah, look, I do think this is a lot of probably more employees are waiting to see
Yeah.
what comes about. Obviously, employers are absolutely looking to understand what they will have to do and those sort of considerations. So, yeah, it's somewhat disappointing it hasn't been put in place yet, because I think that level of certainty around a policy is important at the moment. I know organisations have put interim arrangements and put some things in place, because to give to have working practices that are functioning to support the business and employee preferences. Essentially, yes, the bill came out and there was a lot of pushback because there was 13 different reasons, if we call them that, as to be able to refuse a right to request remote working. And certainly it was felt by particularly the union side that there's way too many options there for employers to say no. So that certainly has been revisited, and we'd expect that the 13 reasons will be more concise and there'll be less options for employers. That being said, businesses have to do business. You know, there's certain jobs that you have to be on site for. There's certain jobs that can't be done remotely or even hybrid. So that practical sense, I think, was built in and will be built into the legislation. It will talk about having a remote working policy in place, which, of course, then every organisation should roll out, and that's going to be their basis for how they manage requests around remote working. So people at the moment are meant to have 6 months service before they can request remote working. That's been challenged as to whether that's a necessity, you know, within the act when it gets enacted. But at the moment, again, employers may propose different arrangements if the legislation goes in its current format. So there's probably still, unfortunately, a lot of questions around this. I think the fundamental part is it's a right to request remote working, not a right to remote working. And if done well, employers and employees, there's a lot of common ground that can help everyone achieve what they want to achieve. The policies will just put parameters around what's required, how we'll respond, in what time frame, and if we feel we can't allow someone to work remotely, we'll give the reason as to why, or we can propose different arrangements, as you rightly point out.
And Derek, I think we spoke about this 12 months ago in regards to when we were coming out of COVID.
Yeah.
All the time ago, we can't remember.
Yes.
And during that time when, you know, we were working from home and things like that, is that we spoke about that. Yes, the legislation was coming down the line, but companies need to figure out what they want to do. You know, obviously we're going to take the minimum requirement in terms of legislation, but are you hybrid working? Are you remote working? What do you want to do as a company? You know, you can't wait forever to get the advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And it isn't government's job, and I'll say it's not a union's job, to tell a business how to run a business and how best to do it. But organizations need to make those decisions, and I think there's been hesitancy in making long-term decisions because of the fear that they roll out their policy and then legislation comes in, and it's something in there is contrary to what they've put in to that. But you're right, I think organizations set out their stall that works for employers and employees, and they may have to change some element of it if the legislation is requiring them to do something in a different way.
Yeah, we'll just pop over to the questions, and it's quite a few about gender pay gap, so we'll just take a couple of them and then keep it on, if that's okay, Derek. So just regarding the gender pay gap, so currently it's for 250 employees. Is that based on overall company size? And I think what they mean by that is it if you've got what this person has is 20 UK employees and then the rest outside, and then some in Ireland and some throughout. So are we looking at global workforce or just what's based in Ireland? Or
I think the language off the top of my head is entity, and by its interpretation would be an Irish entity, so 250 plus in Ireland. There was an update probably late July. It's on Linea there because I know we communicated it out, about clarifications on the gender pay gap legislation, because these are the absolute sorts of questions that come out when organisations start to actually do it. They're unclear as to, well, do we include that, do we not include that? So there's an update, and again, I'm happy to share some of those updates if you want to share out with attendees here today.
But I think, Derek, if we're talking about that, if we're taking the gender pay gap as a D&I, that it's in regards to your stakeholder management, like it's how you want your company to act. It's part of your company culture. You should probably be taking it as an overall figure to make sure that every entity is every location is being treated the same.
Absolutely. So you'll end up potentially having that, and then having your compliance at local level to say, well, we have to do it here in this format, and this is why we have it. But ultimately, so it's a bit like, I'd say, an employee engagement survey. You might have it by department or by region, and then you have your overall company as well. But you're right, the principle should be at organizational level.
Yeah. Okay, so then just in regards to the smaller companies, presumably it is confidential. I don't think so, Derek. I think it's your figures is out there.
No, this will be all public information. So in the UK, you can log onto the website and see every company who's required to issue their gender pay gap. The information is there. That Ireland will follow suit. So they're looking to centralise the reporting online within Ireland in 2023. For smaller companies, as in if we're talking 50 plus employees, when they do qualify, that they'll have to report in a few years' time, that'll be in the mix as well for candidates, stakeholders, other staff, whoever, to see the gender pay gap.
So our industry is unusual in that we have significantly more female team members than males. Does the same approach need to apply to bring in a gender pay balance? So I suppose it does. It's not just female led, it is bringing in the gender pay balance. Both sides, right?
Yeah, but and this, I won't name the sector, but there's a certain sector that would be known to be more female dominated in terms of participation, yet they've a bigger gender pay gap than still, because whilst there's less males employed in the sector, more males are in the senior posts. So it still led to a gender pay gap, which was surprising when I saw the data and when I was talking to the sector as well. But yes, I suppose the short answer is every organisation will be required 50 plus eventually to do that. And it might well be, if you call it a negative gender pay gap, it might well be that certain organisations, because of their demographics, have more females in senior posts, and hence don't have a gender pay gap whatsoever.
Which is, great. Two quick questions. So one is, how many companies participated in your annual HR barometer survey? Hate to put you on the spot there, Derek.
We talked to close to 200 organisations each cycle, and we trend over. So over the last 5 to 6 years now, we've got that trend as to what's changing and what's not. And even at the time when the gender pay gap was being looked at and introduced in 2019, there was still very low levels of activity within organisations to do so.
And I would have this same, we've had the same experience here, Derek, is that it's the misinterpretation of what it actually is. They're like, oh, our male and female people get paid the same.
No, it's and that's why the calculations are so complex, because that actually produces the reasons why the differences exist.
So this is actually an interesting one, Derek. It's actually been asked a number of times in regards to ourselves in terms of HRLocker, when people are storing the data, is that, so I want to start to build a picture of our position with a D&I by taking data for ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability at the application stage as an option, and get the same updated data from current employees, but regularly get questioned if this is in line with GDPR.
Look, super question. The intention is right, but absolutely you could find yourself on the wrong end of a challenge as to, was a decision made on that basis? And again, it's very hard to make a difference if you don't have accurate numbers, from a reporting perspective. I think from a candidate perspective, there's two elements. One is a candidate, and one is they're already an employee. An anonymized candidate basis, to say we had 500 people apply for jobs and 60% were female, with no names attached is very much that, an anonymized set of data that doesn't lead to a decision made as to why someone was or wasn't employed. I would think if you're asking, any organizations asking, have you got a disability? I think unfortunately that could lead to particular challenges where I can't remember the particular report at the time, I think it was the Equality Authority, and that people are less likely to share that they have a disability in fear of not being included in the mix. So I think the statistics around the number of people with disabilities in the workforce speak for themselves and how low they are. And then an organisation can look at their own employees and say, well, how many employees are they aware of who have a recognised disability? So they can make informed decisions in another way, but proceed with caution, I would say, in general around that.
Yeah, and then just in our own experience here in terms of the Northern Ireland legislation in regards to the equality monitoring, it's very well protected in terms of the people who are reporting out. So just for anybody who doesn't know, in terms of anybody applying for a job in Northern Ireland, they have to, recruiting, they have to, every employee gets a survey back to answer specific ethnicity questions and gender questions, and then it gets brought then in regards to recruitment, and then back down to actually if they hire the person as well. But they have to have they have to have the officer, the reporting officer, who cannot be involved in the recruitment process or the management of the person as well. So they have to. I suppose that unconscious bias, Derek, is what
the separation, absolutely. So you can never be accused of making a decision, even unintentionally. Exactly. Around that. Yeah, very good.
Yeah. So in regard, bringing it down here, if you're doing it in the UK or the Republic, it would be very difficult to prove that you have somebody who's completely separate to the process.
Yeah, I think again, depending on obviously the systems that you use, but I think again, how long do you hold data? A lot of organisations after 12 months wouldn't retain data about candidates for roles, but they could, in theory, in practice, retain the number of people who applied and the proportion or percentage that were male or female, because it's anonymised data. And if someone puts in a GDPR request, there is actually nothing there after 12 months to share about the person because their data hasn't been retained. Exactly. Yeah. Okay,
we'll take one more question and then we'll go on. Derek, you're being bombarded today.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good to hear.
I love to see the questions coming in. So, on to sick leave now. So in relation to paid sick leave, are employees entitled to it immediately upon joining the organisation, or can you offer it once they pass probation?
No, it's after 13 weeks service. So similar to the minimum terms of Notice Information Act, that actually only kicks in after 13 weeks service. So yeah, so 13 weeks.
And then I think the same answer for the next one, to be honest, is if you have a favourable sick pay scheme, but it doesn't come into effect until after 6 months, successful completion of probation, are they still obliged to it between 13 and 26 weeks? So I suppose 13 weeks they're getting statutory.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
Moved above. Yeah. We'll take one more question and then we'll move back on, Derek. So where the company already pays sick pay and the employer receives the social welfare benefit, will this process stay the same?
No, is the short answer. And obviously you mentioned kind of Northern Ireland, UK. Obviously they've had statutory sick pay in place for a number of years already, with an onus on employers. So no, the fundamentals around that will change, which will mean absolutely your sick pay policy will need to be updated and obviously reshared out even on that part. And then equally use that as the opportunity to say we've updated other policies such as our dignity at work policies.
Yeah, and then actually there's just one more question on sick pay, so we'll take that and move on. My apologies. Is for sick pay, does the employee's status impact their entitlement? Example, if they're on a short-term contract on a student placement within their 6-month probation, etc., or are they automatically entitled to it? So again, the 13 weeks, they're automatically entitled to it. Or what about if they're on a short? Yeah, that's it first.
Again, I'll double check because obviously it's just only recently been agreed that's going to be put in place, but is it prorated? My understanding it isn't prorated, because if someone's sick in their first, after month 3 and they're sick for 3 days, they happen to be sick genuinely with a doctor's cert for 3 days. And again, it's designed to support employees not be at a financial disadvantage whilst being out on genuine certified sick leave. So I think for any sick pay policy, I always go in with the majority of people are absolutely genuine when they're out sick, and the organisation can support them and somewhat be not at a financial disadvantage during that period of time.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll move on then to the right to flexible working bill. So further legislation has been drafted to put into law around really, I suppose, the employee's right to reflect that, to focus, I suppose, on that way of working, right? So, I mean, this is kind of all, it has probably, we've experienced it during COVID, but it has stemmed from the kind of EU legislation around bringing these kind of rights in regards to flexible working and working from home and things like that. But similar to the request to remote working, so kind of going to be around the same kind of thing, that you've still got those 13 elements to refuse. Is it going to be the same kind of setup, do you think, Derek?
Yeah, well, there's a lot less on this at the moment, but I think it's important for organizations to understand, yeah, like one is about the place of work, be it remote. The other is about, you know, it could be the timing of work. So it's all under ways of working, as you rightly point out, Christelle. But yeah, again, it'll end up with a right to flexible work policy. Everyone loves their policies, but it's important that it puts parameters around that, and it'll allow people to apply for it, and it'll allow organizations to request on reasonable grounds. What those reasonable grounds are, we don't know yet, and I'm sure it'll be as much grey as there will be black and white under the word reasonable. And look, that's what leads to case law, that's what leads to claims, that's what leads to grievances. But I think it's an important development, because sometimes people value the flexibility more than the location piece, and or as important as that. So it's definitely, again, along the lines of what the Taoiseach has said previously, how we work, can we better the work-life balance of everybody? It's not a parents thing, of everyone in the workforce in a better way. And of course, without productivity ultimately being impacted in a negative way. So again, something to keep an eye out for as it comes on stream.
Yeah, the key for me, Derek, is that yes, the remote working, the right to request and the right to request flexible, and some companies might find this as being something that is going to be difficult and affect their productivity. That's not really the purpose of it. The purpose of it is to create a better way of working, ultimately produce productivity and having a happier employee.
It's a rounded approach to the well-being, that the employee whose well-being is positively impacted at work and outside of work is a more productive employee. And even if you look at the 4-day working week trials that are in place, that whilst that's with lesser hours of work, productivity is the target is to still be 100%. Yeah. So it shows that it's not to negatively impact the business, quite the opposite. It's to create a much better overall employee experience, that everyone is that classic win-win, employer and employee. It doesn't mean it's always easy to find and it's always achievable and everyone's reasonable in their approach to it, but it's certainly the direction of travel that we're seeing how organizations are having to work with.
So again, I suppose we're still in that, it kind of feeds into that work-life balance and the miscellaneous provision bill. So this is kind of more, I suppose, the other two we were talking about is specific to everybody. It's not just related to parents or anything, but we're talking about the work-life balance specifically for for parents and carers.
Yeah, so the work-life balance miscellaneous provisions bill, quite a mouthful. Yeah, it covers a number of areas. One is about flexible working for parents with children under 12. So it's acknowledging there is school runs, there's different times of school runs, there's different requirements.
Dentist appointments, doctor's appointments.
Everything under the sun. And that's life, and that's a reality. And how can there be honest conversations to say, if let's be flexible and make it work for everybody where possible. And there's talking about medical care up to 5 days unpaid leave for family members if they're looking after someone. So again, a very practical support to try and make sure it's not disruptive for the business, but the employee isn't taking sick leave to try and look after a carer or someone that they're looking after. And there's other things there about breastfeeding in the workplace and extending it from 6 months to 2 years. So again, many more things for employers to consider. It doesn't mean to be a mass change, I don't think, in general, of uptake. So that particular bill, when it gets enacted, will hit cohorts of employees, But again, it's along the trend of, I suppose, acknowledging that how people work and how they live aren't completely mutually exclusive, and there can be some good common ground to be gotten. Again, if everyone goes in with the right approach, and that's how I always say, the employer and employees go in looking to find a solution, there's potentially a solution to be found there.
Yeah. And is that kind of then feeding into when we're talking about the EU directive on transparent and predictable working conditions? It's a kind of another stepping stone in that direction, is it? Or
yeah, I think in a good way that bill, as we've done a lot as a country around, in terms of Employment Information Act and Miscellaneous Provisions Act. So we're quite far along that journey of elements of that bill. What is of interest in that bill, I think you mentioned, or some of your attendees mentioned, probation. So they're looking to limit the probation time. So it's not going to be just up for organisations to go, oh, we're going to put 11 months in every single contract. So yeah, so they're going to, so when that bill gets enacted, there will be an element in there about reasonable probationary periods, and so if someone's on a 6-month contract, it's not going to be a 6-month probation, and there will be some clauses in there about restrictive covenants and exclusivity as well. So there are some elements of that bill that I think Ireland is quite far on that journey, that we already have legislation that protects employees, but it is essentially, yes, to give people more certainty about their work patterns and how they will work, so they can plan accordingly, both personal time, income, family responsibilities, and there's some other elements of that bill that will impact all organisations, particularly around probation.
And what do you think, Derek? I mean, do you think these are going in the right direction and getting that kind of work-life blend, work-life balance, whatever way you want to do it, and creating this? We talk about the new way of working, which I think is, it's one of these subjects now that I cringe at hearing. I'm like, we've already lived it for 2 years. Now we're in our third year. Is it going in the right direction?
I would have a concern about the amount of legislation. Like we've only touched upon some of the pieces that have happened and some that are happening. And you mentioned whistleblowing, like that legislation has changed as well. So my concern is that's a lot for employers. Great for me, great for our business. Don't get me wrong. And a lot of this will end in dispute at times as well. So again, that's good for if you're consulting or for updating our platform and keeping people aware. But it's a lot for employers to keep abreast on. And employers, I think, again, majority of employers want to do right by the employees and do right by the employees. So over legislating can create a risk. But it is aligned to how we've seen some of particularly the Nordic countries do, and the direction of travel for EU. I think if done right, of course, it's hugely beneficial. And there's going to be a small proportion of employers and employees who don't engage in the spirit of what's intended with the legislation. And that's always going to be the case around something like this. So as a HR person, I go in to say, is what would we like to do? What's the optimal we want to achieve? Which is usually head and shoulders above what the legislation's actually telling you have to do.
Yeah. This next question, Derek, is an interesting one because I think we actually spoke about this last year's podcast, Derek, is the uncertainty around the element of the right to request work. Will the employers be compelled under health and safety legislation to absorb 100% costs for replicating safe home workspace? So I do think there is a lot of grey around this area, and it's going to be more and more, I suppose, heard of in the next 12 months.
Yeah, well, like essentially at the moment, the Health and Safety Authority, there was a lot of leeway given during COVID times, around emergency times. Those times have come and gone from an employer's perspective, so that leeway isn't there. That is their place of work, ultimately. Now, it's not their house, it's not an employee's house, it's their work environment, their ergonomic setup, their desk, their computer, their mouse, the screen, so like, again, we've got technology that does remote working testing and training online. So whereas before you'd nearly have to send a consultant out to do it, which of course is not practical. But yes, it is their place of work. So employers are required to provide a safe place of work under the health and safety legislation, and they run the risk of an issue arising, personal injury claim, whatever it might be, if they aren't providing and are able to demonstrate they're not providing a safe place of work. So yes, you'd expect there are going to be organizational costs. The narrative around that is, well, organizations are potentially making savings on less office space and less people in the office, or they use the office chairs and sent them out because they're ergonomically sound. So yeah, back to kind of a year or two ago, we talked about this. You can't shirk your responsibilities under health and safety for remote working.
And I think as well, as correct me if I'm wrong, Derek, in terms of the right to request work, it isn't a ground to refuse somebody to work from home because you can't afford to ergonomically set them up.
No, because like I think there can be disproportionate costs, and some of it might be, and I know for one organization, that I suppose the integrity of their systems was part of the challenge, and that was their view. It wasn't the purchase of a laptop. But yes, I suppose again, this is where we're really looking forward to the legislation, I suppose, articulating exactly. But things can be cost prohibitive. It'd be probably a hard one to justify that a medium or large size organization can't afford some tables and chairs and a screen and stuff like that. But I know what, again, part of it is, well, we've got them at home and we have the same requirement in work if people are working hybrid, you know. But again, from talking to many organizations, there's not that many days that everyone's in the office at the same place. So they're hot desking, they have their roasters. So there is a potential solution in there.
Yeah, I think so too. Another interesting one, which actually I've come across a couple of times with companies who are hiring a lot of graduates. So hybrid for flexible. What if your concerns aren't practical? Example, it doesn't have to be with the site, but they have a certain level of learning culture.
Yeah.
And there's a big benefit to having everybody in. And I have come across a number of companies who they have that grad program. Obviously, if everybody's working from home and your grads are in, how are you, learning points?
That'd be, I share my views on this, and even for our own business, I'm of the view that there's a lot of learning can be done in many ways. One of the ways, particularly early on for people's career, is by learning from others, and it's hard to do when you're not around them. I know some of the legal fraternities, some particularly the accounting firms, have said this, that yes, we want people to learn, and they can't learn in isolation. So yes, that means other team members or managers will be required to be in to be able to support that learning. I don't see that as a negative. I think that's an organization's decision to do. And I think if they can explain the benefit, the purpose, the rationale right from the outset, and of course make sure it's working, then it's not a bad thing. I think it's the organizations who are fearful of saying it but hoping it happens, they're finding themselves in trouble, because it doesn't necessarily happen naturally that people are in at the same time.
And I also think, just in regards to our own experience here, we run a grad program here, and if you're doing it remotely, it has to be super organized. And we do that here. We have a team that puts it in place. Jenny over marketing, that we have every bit of their day planned, because you have to.
Yeah.
If you're doing it remotely, you put a remote plan in place, but for sure there's definitely benefits around doing it.
You're setting them up for success, whichever way you do, but exactly that. You're not leaving it to chance to say, will the old way work? The old way will not work if people are working in a different way. And sometimes it is that out of sight, out of mind, they forget that, well, what do they have on today? Or, to be fair to graduates, some of them mightn't be as assertive to want to phone their manager to check something, because they could if they were next to them. So whatever you're doing, do it with purpose and make sure it's working for organization, managers and grads.
Yeah. I think we could answer this question, is who pays for adaptations needed for hybrid work? Ultimately, the company will be paying for it.
In general, from a health and safety perspective, yes. Now I've seen some organizations talk about, bring your own device element to it, which is possible, that if people are working from home, they might be using a home laptop. That brings a whole new set of questions and challenges and issues in my mind, about security of data, who else uses the laptop, how is it up to date in terms of virus protection, all the rest. So that bring your own device piece has its own set of challenges. But like, if you're going to embrace hybrid or remote working, set it up for success. Don't, this is a longer term way of working. Make it work, rather than, I suppose, look to say, well, we're not going to give them the tools to do their job effectively, or what they need equipment wise.
Interesting one. I think we've covered this. Is the illness benefit included in the 70% pay or on the sick pay? In it, is the company paying the full amount, or are they claiming for those 3 days? Are they claiming back from social welfare?
So the company pays up to 70%, capped at €110 for those periods, for up to the 3 days, 5 days, 7 days. Thereafter, the social welfare process kicks in after that fact. Yeah.
So those 3 days are an expense to the company, basically.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So in what way would a company change where sick leave is paid until week 26, where insurance kicks in for long-term illnesses?
Yeah, so after 26, if organizations have that PHI, permanent health insurance, that's usually an insurance company decision whether someone qualifies for that long-term benefit as such. So obviously there's a policy that surrounds that. Up to week 26, then in my experience, most organizations who have PHI in place have a sick pay policy that's well in excess of the statutory. So they'll usually have 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks of sick pay on an annual basis, or certainly a rolling basis. So I can't imagine now what they may have though is that the first 3 days doesn't qualify for sick pay under the company scheme. So they may have to tailor that element of it. So this is why it's great to have this session to trigger people to pull out their policy and say it might be very generous, but one part actually mightn't be compliant with the legislation that will come into force in January.
Yeah, makes sense. So in regards to remote working, can you just put somebody on a trial for a while, or if they request, is it like you're in, or is there a trial period?
Yeah, well, at the moment, I think there's been a lot of pilots, trials, to, I suppose, not tie down an organization usually into a way of working that they feel mightn't work for them. I think what will happen is that when the legislation gets enacted will be that it's not intended to be a trial period. It's intended to fundamentally change your terms and conditions of employment, which again will require documentation. So I think it's important that organizations are clear on what they expect from an employee. And it could be in terms of, yes, you're working from home 2 days a week, but your availability still should be during the working hours. So it's not that, it's not flexible working. We're not introducing something different here. It's if we're a 9 to 5 business and you're on the phones, need to be available, and you're in the phone line, you're expected to be there except during lunch break. So it's important that they reiterate or confirm those expectations, so there's no misunderstanding of, well, I've greater flexibility to work, to do how I do my work. You don't. You're just in a different work location, which could be home, could be a designated centre somewhere else.
So yeah, your behaviour shouldn't be the reason why the remote working fails. That's a different HR issue.
Yeah, and again, we know those things exist regardless sometimes of where people work. Yeah. That's down to a motivation sometimes piece. Yeah.
So 2 more questions, Derek. Yeah. You'll be off the hot seat then. Will the extension from 26 to 106 weeks for breastfeeding mothers extend only to mothers whom breastfeed, or will this be offered under general maternity leave? So I suppose it's hard to prove if somebody is it just general?
So I suppose essentially, I'll call it a criticism, but it may be a shortcoming of the legislation, is that most mothers are back in work after 26 weeks, or maybe taking some additional time. So the challenge was, well, how supportive was the legislation of 26 weeks for breastfeeding from a work perspective anyway? So I suppose again, it's designed the legislation looked to be enacted to acknowledge that breastfeeding doesn't finish after 26 weeks or several weeks thereafter, and probably part of the overall government health approach to the mothers and breastfeeding. So I think it will that legislation amend the maternity legislation? You'd expect it will, or if not, it'll stand on its own 2 feet for a mother with greater than 26 weeks to be able to seek that accommodation.
And I think, with legislation around those kind of things, and I take what you say, that sometimes we over legislate for things, but it is important to be having conversations with people when they're coming back to work. How is it going to work? This is what the legislation says. Do you require more? Do you, what is it that you actually require?
Well, and this is the common sense, rather than kind of the mother or whatever might be kind of saying, well, I'm going to try and still do it without talking to my employer. You know, and this goes back to that fundamental trust. Like, why wouldn't an employer support an employee, particularly around this, whereby you're going to, if that could be a stressor, probably is a stressor for the mother, and yet they're having to nearly be covert potentially about what they're doing, much rather than, and same with someone who's got caring responsibilities or has challenges and that they might need a great level of flexibility. I find if there's an open discussion, then everyone knows what the lie of the land is, rather than someone trying to do it in the background, hoping their employer doesn't find out, and it's a blind eye to it.
And then the person leaves in 6 months completely stressed, and you've got to replace the person, and the whole thing could have been avoided.
Yeah. And then the employer says, well, why didn't you tell me about it? And the employer says, well, I didn't think I could. And, you know, you're kind of, well, you know, so back to that, trust and openness piece.
The last question before we let you off.
Make it an easy one now. Don't end now on a big tricky one.
For sick pay, when a person's sick pay goes down to half pay, is it correct that the company continues to take the full social welfare payment, or should this be half to the company too?
Great question. So there's probably a few things to that. Obviously depends on what level of pay the person is on. So in other words, they shouldn't be getting less than what they would get from social welfare.
Okay.
If their pay was, if they're getting half pay. But I suppose the other part of that is, no, they don't need to pro rata the social welfare. Their policy, my experience, most policies will state you will get paid, you know, 50% of your pay less social welfare into their account at the end of the month, whatever time period. So again, the specific wording of your pay policy will dictate what that is. But no, it doesn't mean you prorata the social welfare, as long as they're not coming out with any less than what they would get directly from social welfare is key.
Perfect. So I suppose really thanks a million, Derek, for coming on today. I am kind of aware that people may have had some kind of other questions that maybe they'd like to ask you specifically. So happy enough, Derek, we'll obviously people can contact you on LinkedIn, but we'll have your contact details anyway if people want to contact you directly.
Brilliant, absolutely, yeah. I appreciate. Look, there's always many questions around enactments of legislation and changes, and there's all the nuances. So people come directly to us. Again, obviously our linear platform's designed hopefully to answer those with the FAQs and the updates as such. So by all means, link in.
And I think that's the key with a lot of the questions that we would get from clients, and I'm sure it's the same as yourself, Derek. And I presume the reason why you guys looked at Linea was that a lot of them are just around, well, what does the legislation actually mean to me?
That's it. Yeah. Do I have to? Can I? Should I? And that's what we do. And our FAQs, and even on you talked about the gender pay gap, that clarification came out. So I think we've on one of the pieces of legislation, we've 4 pages of Q&A because there's that many questions arise, and we keep that updated as more and more things happen, and we go off and use our own employment people for legal opinion on this as well. So again, anything to do. So that's why, ultimately with the Linea platform there is to enable people to find the answers that they need, and they might have a different question next week or something else happens that, you know, the FAQs and the policies get updated accordingly. Yeah.
Or there's case law that has defined something.
And that's it. And we've seen it with some legislation or cases around bullying, constructive dismissal, and we've seen it around some actually, whilst it wasn't under the right to request remote working legislation, it was to do with COVID, but they had requested remote working and they didn't get it. And they took a case and were successful in that case. So there's learnings there, and that's the sort of case law that we take, analyse, and put up on the Linea platform.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting, Derek, you alluded to it a couple of times as well, is that there's so much legislation coming out. It can be quite overwhelming for companies to see it, and a lot of the time people are doing more than what the legislation is saying anyway. Yeah. So it's really just that clarity of going, okay, read it, great, get the policy out, make sure we're doing that or more. And now we're happy to go forward.
but even in preparation for today, I have to go back and revisit it to make sure nothing has changed that we've seen. Now that's great. Again, like I use our own resources to say this is up to date. But then budget yesterday, of course, we went through it, and we've already communicated out to Linea members about what changes impact them, a lot around tax. But like that, you get things thrown into the budget that can impact it. Like I know minimum wage was already shared that's going to increase in January, but things like that come out of the budget that have employment implications. So there's a lot to take in, and HR people and organisations are busy with their day job to keep things moving. So look, our job is to get that in front of you, to keep you abreast and aware, so you don't have to hear about something on the news or read in the paper and then stress that you're not ahead of it.
Yeah. Now we will, as always, Jenny, who's with us today, she'll send out the copy of the webinar, but also information around Linea as well, and contact information around that. So thank you everybody for coming in, all your great questions, and thank you, Derek, and hopefully we'll have you on again soon.
Super.
One of the platforms. You're one of my favorite people. You always answer the questions well. So thank you.
Thanks, Rochelle. Thanks, everyone. Great to meet you all. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.